So I know a good morning and good morning to all our participants. I think we can start. I can see that we have about 25 people. So that's a good number. And so my role here this morning, New York time, and also this morning, Paris time, where my colleagues are, is to welcome all of you to this third episode in our series, where we, as the International Resources Panel, we are asking the following question. What does the global future hold? So what are the plausible scenarios for our future when it comes to different sectors and aspects of how we live our lives? As I said, this is the third episode. We're going to focus on agriculture and food, which is very fundamental to how we live our lives. But it also has significance this year because most of you know the United Nations Secretary General is calling for a UN Food Systems Summit. And that says a lot about the importance that he attaches to this particular topic of food and agriculture and production. In order to help navigate us as the IRP on this particular topic, we've invited Dr. Guido Schmidt-Traub, who is a partner at SYSTEMIQ, very illustrious CV. Guido, he's worked on the Africa panel. He's also advised various governments throughout his career. He has been active in all parts of the world. He was, or still is, an adjunct professor at a university in Kuala Lumpur. He also advises the China's Ministry of Ecology, also very active on the World Economic Forum, which focuses on nature and the economy. And I can go on, but I think, Guido, what you bring to this particular conversation is that broad overview, which is what we as the IRP are looking for. So we want to think big and we want to think broad. And like I said, the question we are asking in the context of these global futures debates is, what does this mean in terms of research for the International Resources Panel? You're very familiar with our research. And so that is why we have invited you. Before I hand over to you, just a few housekeeping rules. I have colleagues on this call who are monitoring the chat, and we ask that you stay muted. We will ask you to type your questions in the chat, and we will then read that out so that our guest can answer it. We will also remind you, for those of you who are now very familiar with this modality, that this particular session is being recorded. After Dr. Guido Schmidt-Traub has done his presentation, which will be about 20 to 30 minutes, I will open the floor for a Q&A session. And please make sure that your questions are targeted in a way that helps us as the IRP to think more clearly about where we should be targeting our future research, which will become our flagship report. For those of you who are familiar, it's called the Global Resources Outlook. But Guido, over to you and welcome.
Great, thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here and to discuss such an important topic, and particularly with the IRP, which is doing such really important work. And it's also great to see that the IRP is now focusing so much on food systems, because indeed there are huge challenges, but also huge opportunity. What I thought might be useful, and you've set the scene, of course, very well. We have got a food system summit coming up. We have two in this year. We also later this year in the fall. But we also have two other major conferences that are highly relevant, of course, the climate conference in Glasgow and just before that, the biodiversity conference. And I think those all need to be woven together. There's one common element across these three. It is the food system. So let me just start maybe by just laying out some of what I see as the situation, because my thesis, of course, is that the future of the food system is for us to create and to shape. There's nothing preordained, but on current trends, the system is not delivering on many counts. If you just do if you stack up the economic benefits, so the value of the food that's produced, and subtract from it the costs that are hidden often. So the costs in terms of health costs, obesity, the costs in terms of the environmental impact, and others, you end up with a net negative balance. So the net economic contribution of the food system is negative. This is something that the Food and Land Use Coalition that I'm a part of published and presented in 2019 in the Growing Better report. So what are the major issues today before we come to the solutions? One way to look at it is to divide it into three. To look at the food system in three dimensions: environmental, social, economic, as we often do in the United Nations. On the environmental side, the food system is by far the system with the deepest and most profound environmental impact of any system, far more than the energy system. And it accounts for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, including through the release of greenhouse gases in agriculture, but also critically unsustainable land use, or deforestation, land degradation. If you include to this also, as we should, the marine side, a paper that came out recently showed that deep bottom trawling accounts for more greenhouse gas emissions than the whole aviation industry. So these are quite staggering numbers. The food system, also less known, but perhaps even more severe in terms of the magnitude of the impact, is the nitrogen and phosphorus that are released through fertilizer and other applications. And the food system contributes to large influxes of nitrogen into the oceans, which create dead zones and threaten the long-term stability of the oceans. The food system obviously is a massive use of water. The typical number that's used is 70% of water use goes to the food system, so through irrigation largely. But that only tells you part of the story, because you really need to look at many countries have got plenty of water resources, so it's not a major constraint there. And other countries, and a rising number of countries, of course, experience water scarcity. And in those places, the scarcity weighted use of water for food production reaches 95%. So it really is an absolutely dominant one, which is why efficient irrigation systems are important. And the food system also through land use change is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. There are also growing large concerns about the loss of soils. The Food and Agricultural Organization, for example, has published a report saying that we only have about 60 harvests left in some of the major food production systems. You can debate the numbers, but basically we are using this on an unsustainable basis. And so if you're applying a resource, an IRP lens to this, this really becomes a system that makes very inefficient use of resources, scarce, some non-renewable, but lots of renewable resources. But as the IRP also emphasized, we need to look beyond just the material side of things. We also need to look at the social dimensions. And here, the food system has been phenomenally productive, phenomenally effective in reducing malnutrition, in reducing undernutrition overall. So the incidence of hunger has fallen massively in most countries. In fact, we've got too much food in many places. So we've got rising incidence of obesity, but we also have micronutrient deficiency. So people are not eating a healthy diet by and large, average across population. This applies to rich and poor countries alike. We don't eat enough fruits, vegetables, legumes, too much meat in rich countries, actually too little meat and too little protein in some of the poorest countries. So it's a question of balance. This is another major challenge, and of course there are growing concerns, rightly so, about the economic prospects of smallholder farmers and the growing role of large corporates which can produce food more efficiently, but also do so often at the loss of employment. This is a very, very hard trade-off. And as I've already said, on the economic balance overall is if you include the benefits and deduct the societal costs is negative. So this is a quite a stunning situation. And again, if one applies an IRP type lens, you would have to highlight that about up to one third of food gets wasted. So there is a massive case for more efficient use of food. We're also spending way too much energy to produce food. For example, we eat too much meat, which of course is higher up in the food chain, and so it takes a lot of energy to produce. Plant-based diets can offer much more resource effective food, or can help lead the way towards a much more resource effective food system. So what needs to be done? How can this be fixed, and what are the entry points? I would like to highlight. I would like to propose that we think about this at 3 levels. At the first level, there really is a question of what are national strategies, national food system strategies. And then I do want to focus on some of the verticals, some of the specific campaigns that are needed, and then close with a brief discussion on technologies. At the national level, what really is critical is that countries situate the food system in the broader context. So obviously, a big part of the food system is agriculture and agricultural productivity. But as I've described, it has huge environmental, social implications. So it needs to be looked at in a broader context. And so basically, an integrated strategy, you might say, has to focus on 3 broad pillars. One is sustainable and intensive and sustainable and more efficient food production, which includes also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Second is we do need to manage nature on a sustainable basis, both inside and outside the production systems. For example, on the marine side, science shows that you actually need to protect about 30%, 33% seems to be the number, of the marine realm in order to maximize the productivity of fishing, of the fishing industry. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but to some people. But if you protect 0, then in the long term, the yields, the fishery yields, will actually decline sharply. Obviously, if you protect 100%, you can't fish, and so the optimum lies somewhere in between, and it seems to be about 33%. Even also on the terrestrial side, also we do need to protect certain ecosystem services outside production systems, pollinators, etc. So that's the second pillar. And then the third pillar really has to be looking at demand side effects, so to make sure that people eat healthy diets. So these are demand side shifts, addressing food loss and waste. Now these 3 things are closely interconnected. So the production system, nature, and then diets and food loss and waste. And one of the critical integrating factors is, of course, land use, because you need land to produce food. At least today you do. Some people dream of a future of vertical farming. That can certainly play a big role, but for the foreseeable future, food production, particularly livestock, is heavily intensive in land, and we can't use, or we can only use land for a certain number of applications at once. So there is a design question of how we manage different competing land uses, because if the land is used to expand cities, well, you can't do agriculture on it. And the same trade-offs apply on the biodiversity side. So countries actually do need an integrated land use planning framework. And I know the IRP has begun to look at this. And I would encourage you to do more work on this, because of course these challenges are spatially highly heterogeneous, because biodiversity is in particular locations, you can't move it, and particular locations are very good for producing food, others are not. So you really do need a land use design, land use planning framework. I think that's really, really important. And I would encourage the work that I understand is taking off to look at the spatial dimensions of resource use and to support countries in thinking through spatially explicit analytical framework, but also policy frameworks. And maybe it's just one example. China has been quite aggressive in diagnosing these challenges. They've done a very comprehensive mapping of land use and have moved over a 15-year process into a point where they have now developed a very comprehensive land use design or land use planning framework that looks at agricultural uses of land, urban and industrial uses of land, but also ecological uses of land, watersheds, others. Of course, no system can be transposed simply from one country to the next, but we do need a lot more land use design if the food system is to become sustainable. Some people say that we need a new sort of international conventions for the food system. There are arguments in favor. I think there are also arguments against it. My view is that we have plenty of international conventions and mechanisms, and we need to strengthen them. And so for me, a key short-term requirement also is to make sure that the food system is integrated and is considered in national climate strategies. Those tend to be the ones that have the most impact or the greatest visibility nowadays among the national strategies under international conventions. And if you look at this today, this is clearly not the case. Food systems are barely mentioned in climate strategies. Issues of diets, resource efficiency are not there at all. And they need to be, because after all, they account, as I've said, for 1/3 of the emissions challenge. It's the same on the biodiversity strategies. If you're a biodiversity person, you cannot think about a strategy for conserving and restoring biodiversity without making the food system more efficient, because of course the food system is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss today. But biodiversity strategies don't mention food systems. And that's where I would, so those would be the entry points I would recommend. And I think the Food Systems Summit is a great opportunity to galvanize, to mobilize and draw attention to the issues and mobilize the international community to act on this. Others argue for their convention. That's fine. I think the future will tell what works. But I think, we need to focus, at least in the short term, on the opportunities that we have. That's the overall need for an integrated national strategy, and I think that's what I want to really emphasize. I just mentioned briefly some of the verticals where we need more progress. Food loss and waste obviously is a critical sort of IRP topic, I would say. It is increasingly being recognized, but we lack good data and we lack a clear sense of how to, quote unquote, solve this problem. I can't point to a country that's really done a masterful job at this. So there's a lot of innovation that's needed there. There is a huge question around what some people call regenerative agriculture. So how can we balance agricultural productivity with ecological and other needs? At least in recent years, we've been phenomenally successful at increasing agricultural productivity, even in some of the most advanced agricultural production systems. But it has come at the cost of a steep fall in biodiversity, which is not sustainable. So balancing that, and I think a coalition of forward-looking companies, governments, scientists to think about the coalition for regenerative agriculture strikes me as a very important priority. There are financing questions around subsidies. We can talk about that. And then broader questions about making sure that we continue to raise agricultural yields, particularly in a case of under the advent of climate change, which will of course lead to more droughts and floods in many locations around the world. Those are some of and this is just a snapshot, there are many more, we can come to those in the discussion. Let me close by just my third broad point is on technology. This is a very, very heated discussion for good reasons. There are some who see technology as the solution, or technologies as the solution to problems. Others who say, no, it is actually technology is the enemy because it undermines particularly smallholder farmers. I think we need to take a very pragmatic approach to this. There are some challenges. I've mentioned the need for more drought-resistant crops, for example, that can only be solved because of climate change. That's unavoidable now. those things can only be solved through better technologies. And that's where the international CGIAR system, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, is absolutely critical. We also need, given that it is difficult to see how we can move to an entirely plant-based diet with no animal protein, so no meat or no milk, anytime soon, at least in most countries, we do need to find ways to make the livestock sector to reduce the environmental impact and footprint of the livestock sector. That's another area where I think technologies can play a massive role. Then I've also mentioned the need to diversify diets more in virtually all countries, including the high-income countries. This is where urban agriculture can also play massive role. So we do need to look at this quite carefully. The agriculture technology space has been underinvested, except for a few key levers. And so this is something that, this is an area where I would say the IRP can also make really, really important contributions. So let me close. I focus a lot on what's wrong with the food system. We shouldn't forget that, you know, overall and on a historic, you know, from a historic perspective, the food system has been phenomenally successful in enabling a large population to have enough food. We all remember the Malthusian prediction of instant famine at the 150 years ago. That didn't turn out. That didn't come to pass. And so the food system actually can look back on a history of tremendous ingenuity and change, and we need to harness that energy and that potential now to direct it into a more environmentally sustainable space that is consistent with planetary boundaries and overall resource limitations. But it also, and I think this is critical, we all know this, but it's just really important to emphasize it, that also addresses the social dimensions of the challenge. And this is really, really critical because the food system, this is where people live. So it's an incredibly difficult system to change. This cannot be done top down. And it does require careful deliberation and in particular consultation with the stakeholders, particularly the farmers who derive their livelihoods from the food system. I'm optimistic that this year can set some really important directions for change. I look forward to seeing what's coming out of the Food System Summit, and of course we can discuss some of the specific ideas and opportunities in this call. And I'm also very encouraged by the fact that both the Chinese presidency of the Biodiversity COP and the UK presidency of the Climate COP later this year have emphasized the need for a broader a broader approach to both the biodiversity and the climate challenges, and both emphasize nature-based solutions and also the food system as a critical lever in this. I didn't talk about the need for sustainable supply chains. We can come to that obviously in the discussion. That's another really important priority that's getting a lot of attention. So let me just maybe stop here and turn it back to you. And I look forward to any questions or comments, and particularly if you disagree with anything that I've said, I look forward to discussing that too.
Thank you so much, Guido. And I know that people will start putting questions in the chat, but if I may reflect on what I've just heard. So you've outlined the context, right? Which is, what is the current situation? So why is this particular issue of food and agriculture important in May 2021? It's not an accident that the UN Secretary General has called for a food systems summit. It's not an accident that Glasgow is going to focus on the issue, as you've just correctly pointed out. What's the contribution of the way we produce and farm in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? And it's not an accident that this topic is also going to land at the Biodiversity Summit. So I like the way you framed that. So it's not, we're not doing this exercise to be esoteric. We're doing it because we want to have real solutions to what we think is going to be a real problem. And more importantly, I'm going to start with your end, and then I'll come back to some of the things you said. You reminded us that this is actually a socioeconomic issue, as much as it is an issue of technology, of the way we produce and the way we consume and supply chains, but it is an issue of socioeconomic, and there's equity issues involved. That's my words, not yours, of course. But I took that takeaway. Your numbers really is astounding, and I know that we as the IRP have also put those numbers out, where we said that the impact on the environment, so for example, water, you mentioned 70%, and then in one example you mentioned it's as high as 95%, which is quite astounding. Of course, that's probably an anomaly. You then talk about how do we manage the global system, which is about subsidies. So how do subsidies impact our production and our supply chains? And as you said, you didn't have the time to go into that. If I were to abuse my right as a moderator, what astounded me was you said we only have 60 harvests left, and I made a note of that. And I need you to tell the audience what you meant by that. You said we only have 60 harvests left. And then I panicked and I thought, oh my God, there has to be a technological solution. And then you spoke about the technology, about how to move from a meat-based diet to a plant-based diet. And we know all of these innovations and tech startups are now doing what they call, it tastes like meat, but it's not really meat. And it's a way to reduce our impact on the environment. And then my last sort of, as I say, indulgent question while we wait for comments to come in is in terms of solutions. And you did say we need to talk about the technological solutions. You said, is it time for an international convention? Your own view, probably not. We have too many of those. You then said we need to look at an integrated land use approach. So if you were to simplify that, what does that actually mean? What does an integrated land use? I know what that means, of course. But what does that actually mean? And then lastly, you spoke about countries having national food system strategies. And I thought that was interesting. Certainly for us as the IRP. So all of which is to say, I've abused my right as the moderator, but I want to give over to Maria Jose, who is watching the chat. And Maria Jose, can you see other questions before I give over to Guido to indulge me? But I can wait till the end.
Hello, good morning. I actually only see one here that we just got from Esther. She is saying that in food production and consumption, one of the most effective directions to take from the point of view of reducing land use and impacts, as you mentioned, is to move to a plant-based diet. Trends are in the opposite direction. Let me see, sorry, I lost it. They are coming in, the questions. Trends are in the opposite direction and food habits are very persistent in society. How to make that change in the global society to plant-based diets? That is a question from Esther. Do you want me to take a couple more, Marilyn?
Yes, please, Maria Jose. Two more.
Okay. We just got another one from Garrett Clark. And she is saying, thank you so much. In changing protein demand, less red meat, fish, what do you think about the role of business and media who are driving our aspirations? So the role of business and media for plant-based diets, basically. And what is the role of food? This is from Vera Korosha Karina is the role of food value chains in establishing a sustainable food system. What actions need to be taken to develop sustainable and fair food value chains where environmental consequences and income are equally redistributed?
Guido, I don't want to be you right now. These are excellent questions. Over to you.
These are great questions, and I think we'll have to work together to develop answers over the near future. Just to go through them, on the 60 harvest left, this is a report that the FAO put out a couple of years ago, and it basically touches on the issue of topsoil loss. That we're losing topsoil in many key agricultural production systems. This is more of an issue in certain agroecological zones than in others, so this is not a global, this is not a number that applies everywhere. And as always, this is a number that has been challenged by some scientists. I think the bottom point is, let's not get too fixated on whether it's 60 years or more or less. The bottom point is that, one of the most overlooked, actually least discussed issues is the question of unsustainable use of soil in agriculture, which manifests itself both in terms of the actual loss of soil through wind and wind erosion, and also, of course, water runoff, but also in a sense of losing key biodiversity in soil, which we understand insufficiently well, but we do understand is important also for the long-term health and productivity of the system. Dietary shifts, shift towards more plants, and just to be clear, we shouldn't necessarily eat less fish. We should actually eat, in many cases, more fish, but it has to be sustainably produced. It has to be, we need a lot more aquaculture. We cannot significantly increase the catch of wild fish from the ocean. But these shifts are very, very difficult. And again, it's a little bit like on the energy spaces. There isn't a country that's decarbonized its food system, and there isn't a country that has successfully shifted away from a high protein diet, at least not at significant scale. I'm an optimist on this because we've seen a lot of change in the opposite direction. My Brazilian friends tell me that 30, 40 years ago, Brazil was not a high meat-eating country because meat was expensive and it was in scarce supply. This is, of course, completely changed. Brazil consumes 80% of the beef that it produces. And so if this change can go in one direction, I see no reason why it couldn't go in the other direction. But how to do this is, of course, the million or the billion-dollar question. And many governments are beginning to grapple with that. I think the first point is to actually connect the policy discussions. If I can just focus on the European Union for one moment, the European Union has until last year basically discussed the question of agricultural production. What and how much should be produced separately from the question of what actually constitutes sustainable and healthy diets. Those two discussions were not linked. They were not linked institutionally, and they were not linked in terms of policies, and that's why the European Union has put forward its farm to fork strategy, which wants to do many things, but I think for me, one of the most important things that it does do and does plan to do is to bring the production and the demand side closer together. And of course, that critically includes also food loss and waste, so the loss of the production system before the farm gate, and then also the waste of food after the food has left the farm gate. Again, this is sort of almost, this is almost a perfect IRP framing of the challenge. And that's really what needs to happen. So I think that's the first step that really is needed. And that's what I meant by integrated food strategies that, of course, need to start with the diagnosis. Countries need to chart out what kind of food system they would like over 10, 20, 30-year basis. So this raises several questions of how much land should be used for food production. What kind of food production is desired in order to ensure healthy diets? For many countries, China, for example, is not a critical example. There's also a high focus on self-sufficiency, so to reduce food imports. And that might be, I mean, that's for every country to judge, but that might be a good idea for some. So that's another dimension in this food strategy. And of course, the climate piece also needs to come back in, because remember, 1/3 of the climate problem, just to be simple about it, is the food system. And so countries need to diagnose these issues and basically develop a long-term strategy, long-term pathway. And there's an analogy for this that's exactly what countries have started to do on the energy side of the climate ledger. So energy is including the power system, buildings, industry, transport, the basic practice of doing long-term pathways or backcastings to 2050, when we have to be at zero emissions, and then working backwards from them to see what are the changes needed over the next 5, 10 years in order to get to zero emissions by 2050. That practice has become quite widespread. And it's even become a formal instrument in the Paris Climate Agreement, because under the Paris Climate Agreement, countries have to submit the nationally determined contributions, which is what most commonly is referred to as the climate strategies. These typically are 10-year strategies for reducing emissions and increasing resilience. But lesser known is Article 4.19 of the Paris Climate Agreement, under which countries have to submit long-term strategies through to 2050. But also really critical, because you cannot determine what to do over the next 5 years if you don't have a sense of how to get to zero emissions in the case of energy. And the same analogy applies, the same principle applies to the food system, except that it's more complicated, because here we need to get to zero or even negative emissions by mid-century. Countries need to get to balancing the supply of food with the needs for a healthy and sustainable diet. By sustainable, we typically mean that the diet should minimize resource impacts and resource use. And other constraints need to be met, most importantly also the socioeconomic ones, the needs of rural communities that I've already mentioned. And that's something that doesn't happen when countries don't have these integrated long-term food system strategies. And I think maybe one simple proposal, and of course it doesn't solve all the issues, but one simple proposal would be for countries to develop these integrated food system strategies as part of their overall climate strategy. And again, this is to tackle parts of the climate issue, but also to go beyond it, to look at the biodiversity and other resource implications, plus the socioeconomic drivers. That's something which please, yeah.
No, I just want to make sure that you also respond to, that's a very comprehensive response. Thank you. But I also want to make sure we respond to Garrett's question, which is sort of on the other end. How do we deal?
So can you just repeat the question? I forgot which one was Garrett, I'm afraid.
Yes, Maria Jose can repeat it. So Garrett came at it from a very different angle. She's basically saying, how do we deal with the people who basically shove food down our faces? But Maria Jose is going to be far more elegant than I am.
Well, I think I got the gist of it.
Maria Jose, do you want to repeat Garrett's question?
Yes, Garrett is asking that in changing protein demand, less red meat, fish, what do you think about the role of business and media who are driving aspirations?
I think that's something that needs to be addressed squarely and directly. I mean, the quality of the global diet in many, particularly the affluent countries, has deteriorated massively through a shift towards ultra-processed food, which food companies make high margins on, but which is terrible for the health of the people who eat it, and it's also terrible for the environment. So that needs to change. And food companies need to step up. There needs to be a much more honest discussion about healthy and unhealthy food. And this is difficult. I mean, Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York City, said that it was easy for him to tighten energy efficiency requirements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But as soon as he touched the soda tax on sweetened drinks, he unleashed a firestorm of lobbying, of protests against. He thought this was the toughest thing. He wasn't able to ban soda vending machines from schools where they demonstrably lead to very unhealthy eating habits that are often then locked in and certainly contribute towards the obesity pandemic. This needs to be addressed very heads on, just like the fossil fuel companies need to stop producing fossil fuels. So this is clearly something that needs to be addressed. In terms of the media, of course, there's lots of advertising for unhealthy food. Some countries are clamping down. For example, France is clamping down on advertising for unhealthy food, just like we have banned advertising for liquor and even some forms of alcohol and cigarettes in many public places. So this certainly is something to consider. But we're also seeing many companies, and we're seeing the media reporting this much more proactively now. In my experience, we're seeing large companies really changing their views and realizing that they need to build a different economic model for the future that cannot rely on the highly processed food. This is a slow process that needs to move much, much faster. That's what we need. We need more and better science and data to demonstrate impacts and also demonstrate a path towards a healthier food system. We do need hard-headed advocacy on this, just like the fossil fuel industry does respond to climate advocates. We do need the same on healthy food and healthy diets, and we need a lot of problem solving. Actually, sit down and see what does this really mean for global supply chains. That's beginning. I'm very encouraged with what I'm seeing, but is it enough? And is it moving fast enough? Not yet. And that's what the Food Systems Summit also is a great opportunity to shine a spotlight on.
Thank you, Guido. Maria Jose, do we have any follow-up questions?
Yes, we have 3 questions. One is on methodology, the other one on diets, and the last one on national strategies. The first one is from Suzanne Langsdorff, and she's asking, can you maybe say something about the World Economic Forum Nexus approach? It says land, soil, biodiversity. This nexus is an established approach, but seems insufficient without land and biodiversity. At the same time, the concept may become too complex to have positive political impact. So she's asking if you can say something about the approach, and also, do you think of any examples where an extended nexus approach has been used successfully, so including land and biodiversity? That is the first question. The second one is from Susan again, but this time it's on diets. In Germany, it seems, at least also in the US and other countries, the discussion to reduce meat consumption is very emotional. Do you think this is a real cultural issue, or do you suspect that it is also fired up by lobby groups? And the last one here that I have is from Francesca Rosa. It says, thank you very much for your talk, very interesting. She was wondering how other countries could map everything and implement an effective land use strategy like China did. Do you know of any specific actions, policies? What would really push policymakers to take a step towards this approach, not only from the production side, but also dealing with consumption in terms of impacts of the supply chain? Over to you, Peter.
Great, these are great questions. Just on the diets, I think.
Just to correct myself, it's not, she wrote WEF and I thought it was the World Economic Forum, but actually she meant the World Energy Forum. And that was the.
Sorry, thank you. So just on diets, I think we touched on a few of these points. This is a very, very complex issue. This is not just, this is a technical issue because people just eat the wrong food. They need to, and this has been beautifully described by the Eat Lancet discussion, but it's clearly not just a technical issue because diets are also, in some cultures, you say, what you eat, you are what you eat. Food is a very important part of identity. And so it's something that needs to be looked at very, very carefully. The consumption of meat is looked at very different in a place like in Argentina compared to India, and the difference is cultural, historical. I think that has to be part of it. There is There cannot be one size fits all. And also this touches on livelihoods. So any changes to a system, particularly one as complex as a food system, will have impact on people's livelihoods. And so there is no easy answer. This has also become, as the person asking the question has rightly underscored, it has become a cultural issue in some places. Don't touch my meat, as one example. And so this is why we need good science, but we also need good nudging strategies, good communication, a lot of listening. This is very, very difficult. And that's why, once again, no country has really taken this on, but successfully. Countries have started. But this is now beginning to change. I mentioned China. Xi Jinping has actually now made a public statement about the need to curb meat consumption, which is a massive statement from a country where until recently people ate too little animal protein, and increasing consumption of animal protein was a sign and a signal of development as well. So things are changing. On the Nexus side, there are many different Nexus approaches out there. I think the last thing we want to do is to focus on the small differences between them and lose sight of the commonalities, which are massive. The basic point that agriculture, food production, and nature need to be looked at together, I think, is critical. I think here it's important to strike the right balance between breadth, integration, and specialization focus. So, for example, I would not be in favor of looking at one integrated system that covers energy as well, and the food system, just because it becomes too big, too complicated. That's not to say that there aren't important links, at least through biofuels, but we need to integrate, but also we need to specialize. Otherwise, we just risk staying at the level of generalities, and that's why I'm a big fan of going deep on the challenges, but with an understanding of the system boundaries. The other challenge, particularly for the scientific community, is that there's a huge difference between coming up with a framework to describe a system and to describe what's wrong with the system on the one hand, and then coming up with a framework that can guide policy change and operational change also by policymakers. And there is no shortage of frameworks to describe the food system. We haven't, I would argue, really cracked the nut yet of what are the best ways to understand and to operationalize the action levers that need to be pulled in order to make the food system sustainable. There's a lot of wonderful work that's been happening. I've also been involved in some of it through a global network of country teams called the FABLE Consortium that's been looking at these long-term, looking at developing long-term pathways. But I don't think that network has fully cracked the problem. I don't think anyone has. We need more clarity on this. And this requires both integrated views over what a pathway towards a single system might look like, and then very focused discussion on the verticals, for lack of a better word. And that really is a big challenge for science, and this is something that often leads to misunderstandings on the science policy interface, because scientists don't always understand well enough what the policymakers need, and I don't need to tell you that the policymakers often don't understand the science, and that's what we need to break through. And I believe these pathways, particularly if they're integrated into climate strategies, can be an important tool. They can become a method for problem solving. On the land use side, and on the application of the Nexus, that was one part of the question: has the Nexus approach been applied anywhere? And I would say increasingly so. I think the EU, the European Union's farm to fork strategy is almost a perfect illustration of the Nexus approach. It's a difficult policy to implement, and there's a lot more that needs to happen on that front. But I think it really is a policy that's designed and that's informed and motivated by an understanding of what you can call a nexus or the integrated food and land use system, And critically, for example, one thing that it does is actually take some decision-making power away from the Directorate General for Agriculture and gives it over to Sante, the Health Director General, because that's where a lot of the impacts are felt. Final point just on land use planning. This is incredibly difficult because the reason why you don't, we've done analysis of all the climate strategies, and not one single climate strategy includes a map that's actionable. And that's all you need to know to conclude that the climate strategies in their current form today do not deal with land use change, therefore the food system, in an operationally explicit way, because you can't do this with maps. Without maps, sorry. You need these maps for the diagnosis, but also for the accountability. Why don't we have maps? Well, there's a small part of the problem, that's the technical side. And the data that's coming on stream, I would argue that's not really the difficult part. The real reason is that it's very, very difficult to adjudicate between competing land uses. In many countries, you have illegal concessions that are being illegal mining concessions, logging concessions that trample on indigenous people rights. They're powerful people who benefit from these, and that gives you a reason why those people wouldn't have an interest in making maps explicit. But even a country like the UK does not have a spatial planning framework for its natural lands for a whole host of reasons, including the challenge of driving and guiding land use change on privately owned land. We do this in cities all the time. Every city has got zoning rules. If you own a plot of land, it doesn't mean that you can build a petrochemical factory in the middle of the city. You just can't. And so similar approaches are needed, and Brazil has shown that you can, through its forest code, that you can actually guide land use on privately owned land. The final example I want to or one specific example in closing, I just want to put on the table is Costa Rica. Costa Rica is famed for its regeneration and its biodiversity conservation, and combining that with a high standard of living through agriculture, but also very efficient agricultural production systems. And Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the former environment minister, describes the story of how this became real. And it became real when he put a map of the restoration areas on the cabinet table. And his agriculture minister said, "Oh, that's interesting, you have a map." I have a map, but they're not the same. They're not consistent. They then sat down and actually worked out, basically put the maps, overlaid them, and came up with one that worked from an agricultural and from an ecological perspective. And that really was the start, so he says, towards an integrated policy approach. That's why the land use planning part is so important. And from a food system perspective, one of the critical asks, I would believe, for the climate convention should be that countries put maps of their intended land use into their national climate strategy. Doesn't solve all problems, but it's a big step towards addressing some of the key issues in the food system.
Thank you, Guido. Maria Jose, I don't know if we have any questions, but I just want to quickly, I think, address two things which we as the IRP need to take into account. And I'm thinking about our young people, our youth. I have an 18-year-old son, Guido, who is convinced that we're going to live on Mars, believe it or not, convinced. He's completely convinced. The possible future for food for him is the Beyond Meat, those startups. And he's tried every single burger that's based on what happens in laboratories. So he's convinced about that. He's convinced about agri-tech and innovation. He's convinced about genetically modified foods. He's convinced. And as I was listening to you, and as I look at myself as a 53-year-old, I'm thinking, we should have brought the youth into this conversation, because our question is, what's the possibility, right? How can we imagine our future? And you shouldn't ask me, I'm too old. You should ask Matthew, my son, and maybe, young people around. So I think that's also the question about that we're trying to pose as the IRP, and not trying to be facetious. It is trying to imagine I think you're right about having plans. I think you're right about countries making sure that when they submit their national determined contributions and ensuring integrated land use planning. But the innovation and the tech seem to be missing from this conversation. What do you say?
I agree with that. I mean, most importantly, I agree with the fact that I have no idea what the food system might look like in 5 or 10 years, and what the opportunities for technology are. There are remarkable things happening. You know, many of us know of Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers, so the plant-based meat alternatives. I've tasted them. They actually do taste quite good. I think there's a real shift underway, and the young generation I'm seeing is at home with my kids. They think very differently about food, and they think very differently about what's needed. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg of the innovation that's happening. Also in terms of driving agricultural productivity, the data revolution, vertical farming. There's a huge amount happening, and I think it will change things quite profoundly. I still think that the kind of, you know, thinking through what a plan might look like is critical because of the land use dimensions that we've discussed. But also, and this is what General Eisenhower always used to say, is he says, you know, every time, you know, he went into battle, he realized that the plans that he carefully drawn up were useless, because nothing ever unfolds the way you plan for it. But the planning approach, actually thinking through the different options, was absolutely critical, because it allowed him to then respond, having thought through the different eventualities. Now, fortunately, we're not in a war situation, but I think this principle does apply to what we need to do as well. We do need to think these things through, and we need to have discussions between the farmers, between the ecologists, between the health experts in every country about what is a way to make this system more sustainable. And within that, we do need the technology disruptors. We do need to ask ourselves the question of how someone like Elon Musk would look at the food system, because that is going to be part of the solution for sure. The one thing that I can guarantee you, though, is not going to be the solution is all of us moving to Mars. That's definitely not going to be the solution. Maybe there is enough space for Jeff Bezos on Mars, but not for all of us. And so let's really focus on fixing this Earth. And I know that's what the IRP is also committed to. And that's why we're so proud to be partnering with the IRP on this.
Excellent. Thank you. Maria Jose, I think we have 5 more minutes for any last question.
There is one last question. I'm seeing in the chat that it's from Ray Marcos Martinez, but he says that you already partially answered it. It was about how to better coordinate actions from a global perspective, because to achieve sustainability targets, we need to take into account, you know, sometimes the connections between domestic food and land use systems, and also the large impact that transnational companies have in terms of driving or limiting change in food and land use systems. So I don't know if you want to add anything on how to better coordinate actions from a global perspective.
So we've just added an hour to this conversation, obviously. So
no, you're only allowed 2 minutes.
I know. Well, we need the global conversation, because all the national strategies need to add up, for example, to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And countries have a tendency of saying, well, my system is really hard, let others be more aggressive in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which doesn't work. So that's one part. Second is we do need shared approaches of governance on this. This is where the climate strategies come in. I think it's incredibly useful that every country has to put forward a climate strategy and report on its progress in regular intervals, because it creates cooperation, learning, but also accountability and a race to the top. That's why I'm such a big fan, and I think what a must do is to, quote unquote, integrate the food system into climate strategies, because it's a system that works, not perfectly, but it is moving in a good direction. Third, this is where IRP and others come in, is this is difficult, and it makes no sense for every country to solve the same types of problems, even though every system is unique, food system, from a clean slate. So we do need tools, methods, approaches of what works. And this is what we're really just beginning. We're beginning, if you want to understand how to design a renewable feed-in tariff for renewable power, there are resources you can go to. You can click on a button and see all country strategies of what they're doing, compare, learn from them. We don't have that in food systems, really. If you really want to understand how to reduce food loss and waste, there isn't a good place to go to yet. So I think there is a lot of learning and sharing that needs to happen there. And obviously, and then the final point is we need the data. We need, on the global level, we need global data collection systems. Satellites can now monitor everything. They can monitor land use. This is helpful for governments who want this data, but it's also helpful for civil society and others to hold governments to account to their own commitments. So those are some of the things that I see. And sorry, the final and perhaps most important thing is we do need international cooperation on this. This is many common goods. So, you know, the supply chain discussion cannot be reduced to simply saying we, for example, the Europeans should just stop buying Brazilian beef without thinking through what are the alternatives to an economic development in Brazil. Obviously, this is not for the Europeans to decide what Brazil should do, but there has to be a conversation about how the world can finance the support of critical ecosystems and biomes like the Amazon, and critically how every country can fulfill its right to development. And if unsustainable food production is not the way forward, well, what are the alternatives? And this is something that needs to be discussed. So we need to bring the economics into this. And in many cases, this will require also international solidarity and international assistance for some of the poorest countries.
Guido, that's actually a good note on which to conclude this particular episode. As you said, part of the solution lies in our common heritage. So our common heritage is about solidarity. It is about protecting our ecosystems.
Yeah.
And coming back to the previous question, Maria Jose, that you read out from our colleague who was joining us online, that's also a good way to remind us about the importance of global coordination, because these things don't happen in isolation. Well, you know, what happens, as you said, Guido, in Brazil impacts what happens in Germany, for example. And so just to summarize, I think this was extremely useful, and to say thank you to you, Guido, for making us, as the International Resources Panel, think about the following question, which is how we started this episode, which is how can we, as the IRP, add value to the ongoing research efforts when it comes to understanding food and agriculture and its impacts, not just environmentally, but also socioeconomically. So where can we add value? And I like the way that you started this conversation by reminding us that nothing is preordained. And so there's room to actually push and ask the difficult questions and hopefully come up with solutions. And also, and I'm putting it in my own words, you basically said it doesn't have to be this way. You know, we don't have to continue to produce and consume in the way that we have. And you mentioned several times the issue of supply chains and how everything is connected. And to all our participants who asked very good questions about what's plausible, regulation, processed food, the push or the pull, if you like, when it comes to marketing and messaging, the issue of technology, which we didn't go into, and then more importantly, our takeaway as the IRP Secretariat is we're going to make sure that as we go into the next production of our Global Resources Outlook, because that's our flagship, and we want to be able to make sure that we treat this topic with the rigor and the seriousness that it deserves. And so for those of you who have posed questions, thank you so much. We are going to be looking at it. We're going to produce notes, and we're going to provide this to our group of researchers who are helping us with our Global Resources Outlook, which is actually looking at the future for all of us. I should also just quickly say thanks to my secretariat colleagues who've actually thought about this. It wasn't me, this particular series, and I want to acknowledge Ainoa, Yian, Maria Jose, all of the secretariat colleagues who've put a lot of effort into it. We also have Heinz, our colleague in Australia, who is very serious about asking the difficult questions. All of which is to say, Guido, thank you so very, very much. And for those participants who've stayed online for the past hour, thank you again. And like I say, we've used your ideas, and we will use your ideas, and hopefully to enrich our own research process. Thank you so much, and have a good evening or good morning or good afternoon.
Thank you very much also.